Hey guys, how's it going? So today I'm going to show you how I would do an interior lighting scene in Lumion. What I'm going to do right off the bat is I'm going to get my picture. I'm going to put the realistic effect stack on it. I'm going to change the heading just so that the sun is where I want it. And then I'm going to start adding the effects that I want, which is obviously pretty standard. But what I've already done is I've already gone through and I've printed out almost comparisons of the realistic effect stack and then adding in each effect just so that we have the before and after. Things like skylight, the gamma correction, temperature. I'm going to be going through all of these things just so that you have a better idea of how to light your scene in Lumion. As kind of a rule of thumb, I actually try to avoid using spotlights, fill lights, and area lights almost with everything. I find that it's a lot more trouble than it's really worth. I always try and get the light from, at least when I'm doing interior scenes, coming in from the window, or I'll just completely remove a wall in my model that can't be seen by the camera. And that way you get the full use of the real skies effects, the sun effects, and I just find that it's much easier to get a balanced photo and to get something that's a little closer to photorealism. When I first started using Lumion, I'd always try and just put spotlights on every single physical modeling of a spotlight, but that is a pretty easy way to overpower the model quickly. Like if we look at my lighting here, while I do have one on each, they're only at 1.3, which I'll just move this camera quickly so you can see. So this lamp is it's a pretty strong lamp. Like I believe that Lumion uses the IES lighting, which is kind of like a preset lighting so that you're like certain lamps are going to look different ways, and this one is almost like a floodlight. It's very strong, but I just wanted it to have a little bit of impact kind of on the top shelf here, and when I start going through the stack you're going to be able to see why I kind of picked that, although I probably could have just removed it and you wouldn't really get much of a difference. But yeah, for this kind of scene I would try and avoid spotlights as much as you can. Typically, I only use spotlights as to give like a little bit of shadows. It sounds kind of counterintuitive, but I don't really think that they should be used for interior lighting because you're just not going to get the shadows that you're going to get from lighting your scene with the natural light that can come in through the windows. So, anyways, we'll get this started now. So, first thing is I have my camera set up. I'm going to take a completely raw photo here. So now obviously there's nothing special going on with this. The lighting is, nothing special at all. So first I'm going to go realistic. And right there, I mean, most of the time you can probably just get away with using the realistic effect. But I'm going to add some more stuff in just so that we can get a good idea of what's going on. So I'm going to render this one out. I think I'll put this at about 75. That way, a good way to kind of tell where the sun is you can see that the sun would be over in this area here based on the shadows that are coming from the chair, the window frame, and then also the lampstand. So I'm going to render this out quick. Lighting renders, yeah. So we'll just do one. This doesn't take too long to render now. It will take a little bit longer once we get going. But yeah, for a render that took maybe like 30 seconds to set up, in reality, that's a pretty good start. But we're going to be able to add some more detail to it. The first effect that I want to talk about is bloom. So bloom is an effect that it kind of makes it so that the light outside is stronger than the light inside. I guess that's the best way to describe it in just, I guess, common terms. We have I have an example here if we want to pull this up. Lighting, effect stack, bloom. Now, this picture here is basically the one that I just did. I've already gone through and made all these pictures for us to compare, and so this is the raw realistic stack, and then that's with bloom added in. So when bloom is at 0.5, and I'm going to make all of these available to download below the video, so if you find it easier to follow along with your own folder, you'll be able to do that. But as I was saying, the bloom effect, it just kind of makes the light outside a little more stronger. And mostly when I'm doing this, you can see the biggest changes happening obviously in the white near the top here. But then if you look at the shadows on the floor, you're also, like, they are losing some definition because it's almost lighting up the rest of the scene. More light is coming in the window. And you see this a lot more when we go up to 1. So this is way too strong. Unless you're doing like a very particular effect, like the only way that I could really see that you'd want to use bloom of 1 is if you're doing like something like a heavenly scene or something, and you wanted, you know, tons of light to be like flooding in so that the light is overpowering. And then 2 is just way too high. Like I don't see how this would ever be used because it's almost completely eaten the chair. Like you can't even tell that it's there. You can't see almost any of the background. So I think that when I use bloom, the perfect amount is about 0.5. You just have to adjust it to what fits your scene. With lighting, there's no, I guess, right and wrong for the most part. It's just what you think looks the best. There are common practices. Obviously, you don't want to have this happening, but you know, maybe there's some scene where that has to. So back to Lumion. We're going to add that in quickly and go to the next effect. So I will render that out now. We'll do 2. And yeah, we see that extra light coming through. The next effect that I want to look at is exposure. So exposure is kind of, it's very similar to the brightness and color correction. It's kind of just a blanket, I guess, lighting tool. Like when you turn it up, the shadows and the areas with light are going to go up. And when you turn it down, it just makes the whole scene darker. Just based on the testing that I did before the video, for this scene, I think that 0.4 is a pretty good place to have it. If I go into the pictures that I printed off, so this is a 0.5. This is kind of the standard, the default setting. And then that's 0.3. So as you can see, it's just the whole scene that's changing. Some effects are going to focus more on the shadows and the light, but this one is just a blanket one. And that's mostly what I found with the brightness and color correction too. So when we go through color correction, I probably won't talk too much about brightness because it is kind of, you know, just explain itself. If your scene is too bright, then you just turn it down. But you can see the difference that those two makes these two make right here. So in this one, we kind of expect the shelves to have a lot of shadows in them like that. And you can see my spotlights. They're very faint, but that's why I added them in here, just so you get a little bit more, I guess, a little bit more definition just kind of in the shadows here. So yeah, that's just way too much, in my opinion. Even that's the default, but then that's just like far too high. So yeah, that one's good. Now I'll look at the other color correction one. So for this scene, the realistic effect stack typically has a 0.4 temperature, which is, it's pretty high. Like that's a pretty warm scene. If we open these up and we go in, this one really is just depending on what you think the scene should look like. When I'm kind of flipping through these, like this to me seems like it is very warm. As I said, this is the default one, but this seems, I guess it kind of reminds me of, you know, someone is, you know, in this house, someone is home right now, but since it's a bright afternoon, you know, none of the lights are on really. They're just going to sit down and read a nice book. That one, this to me looks the most realistic, and this is the one I'm going to be using in my stack, but this is just 0.1. So this has a much cooler look to it, but it doesn't necessarily make me feel like it's like a cold scene. It just kind of looks like, you know, no one's really home. The lights are off and the person could be back any minute. This, if we look at this, this is -3. So this is just it's too cold to me. Like this doesn't really make any sense why I would ever want to use that for this particular scene. Again, temperature is really just what you want to convey with the picture. If you have a scene that's, you know, maybe in a winter meadow or something like that, well, you're not going to have, you know, this warm effect because it's not warm outside. You don't want the person to have this feeling of warmth. It's a cold day. But then if you were to go inside in that same scene and you were inside a cabin, then you would want to turn the temperature up because you want the person looking at your picture to be able to feel kind of that warmth, that, you know, they're not in that cold exterior outside. And it, that thinking about that kind of thing when you're making your lighting is very important, because subconsciously, if someone looks at the picture, what are you trying to tell them with it? And I think that that's a pretty good way to describe the temperature. It's completely up to you. it's not going to change, for the most part, the lighting. It's just going to change the feeling of, I guess, the story that lighting tells. Then, so for this one, yeah, I said we're going to go down to 0.1. The tint is kind of similar to the temperature. This one, it's just kind of helps you balance out the oranges and the greens in the picture. For this one, I just leave it on the default. If you want to turn it down a little bit, you can just put it on 0. But I think that with a warmer scene like this kind of is, I think 0.2 is a pretty good one. But the way that temperature lets you bring down kind of the orange and the reds and adjust it with the blues, you get kind of a different shade of orange and green to kind of balance it with. So that's just something to keep that in mind with tint. Now brightness, this is the one that, as I mentioned, it's very similar to exposure. As the scene goes down, it changes, but it won't bring it down quite as much as brightness, like as you see, or as exposure. As you can see here, I could bring brightness all the way down, and it doesn't completely remove the scene. I think I figured that this one's good for 0.6, but if I go back to exposure, if I bring it right down, there's nothing there. It's completely gone. So while they are very similar, I guess I should have kind of correct that and say that the color correction brightness, it just isn't as strong. Like if you put it down at 0, it won't completely destroy your scene, as if you put it up, it won't make it completely white either. So that's just something to keep in mind. Contrast, most people would probably know this one. Like this just kind of, yeah, I guess it just kind of affects like how the colors interact with each other. I believe it's similar to a sort of like a color ramp. Saturation, that is just kind of how prominent the colors are in your scene. I have some examples of that one here. So this is just the this is at 0.5, and that's pretty low. So as you can see again, it just kind of depends on what you want for the scene. I want a little more color in this one, but if you wanted something that is maybe even supposed to look more old, like almost like a black and white photo, but you don't want it completely black and white, then turning the saturation down might be nice. When I kind of think of this effect, what I almost picture is someone doing, like a flashback where you're almost looking at an old house or something, where you don't want it to have you don't want the color to be completely gone from the scene, but you also don't want it to have this popping effect. This one is just the default one, so that's what we're going to probably keep it at. I don't typically play around with this effect too much. I kind of try and get the scene to work with other effects, but if you wanted to turn the saturation up or down or just tweak it a little bit, I wouldn't go too far from 1. So as you can see, when you turn it up, it becomes just way too like orange. It's warm, but it's also this like, it's just the colors just look off. Like if you look at like these pots, for example, they just look almost like pure red, and so does the copper in the back here. So yeah, this one should definitely just be used kind of with a grain of salt. The gamma correction is the next one I want to talk about, and this one's kind of an interesting one because I had never used this before. I kind of sat down to learn what it does, but if you only adjust it a little bit, you can actually get some pretty cool effects with it. So here's just the standard default setting, which is 1 for gamma. But then when we turn it down, this is what we're left with. And again, with this one, you kind of have to use it with, just be mindful of how much you're using it, because this can really overpower the scene. Outside, it's almost completely sucked the realistic lighting that I was going for in the scene right from the background. And while you are kind of getting this cool lighting effect here, it's not realistic, and you have this strong light coming through the windows, and the shadows here are pretty they're pretty sharp, and that's the kind of thing that you would see on a sunny afternoon day. Yet not only do we have clouds in our background, but the gamma correction is basically taking all of the light out of that. So if this was an overcast day like our exterior is kind of looking like right now, then you wouldn't be getting those shadows really. You may get a little bit coming through, but you wouldn't get these sharp shadows. So if I saw this picture right off the bat, I'd say something's not right here. But it is kind of interesting to see. And then that's with it turned all the way up. So it affects the areas with shadows the most. Like if you look at these flipping back and forth, you can see that the areas up here that's darker are completely gone, where the areas on the couch is definitely looking different, but the lighting is still strong in that area. So that is a good one kind of to keep in mind. For this one, I think I just turned it down to like 0.9 or something like that, because I didn't want it to have this effect of being a little bit more dark, but I also didn't want it to just completely overpower the scene. The limit lows, these are kind of interesting ones, because I found that using, this is when it's at 0 and 1. So this is the effect when you turn the limit low up to 0.2 and then you keep the limit high at 1. It does give this, I guess, in some ways I do kind of like what it does, where it's making the scene have much more defined shadows and it's keeping it warm, but I just think that it makes the areas over here where there's color in the shadow, those aren't going away. So this one, again, I think you'd probably be safe with just keeping it at 0 and 1, and then using the other effects that are much easier to control to kind of get that look that you want. Because what I thought was sort of interesting is that 0, when you put the limit up to 0.2, and you look at our default, there's this massive difference. They're two completely different photos. But then when you turn the limit high, just down to 0.8, the only really big difference that you see is the shadows are getting a bit brighter. But if you look off into the distance here, as we're turning it up and down, you're just kind of getting more of that background, like a dehazing effect. So they're, yeah, I typically don't use the limits because I find, as I said, like it just makes things kind of harder than it should be. So yeah, for this one, I'm pretty happy with the temperature. Probably just turn the tint down to 0.1 actually. Turn the brightness down a little bit. I left contrast and saturation the same, but I did turn down the gamma correction a little bit. And I think that I'm pretty happy with the color correction here. So let's go render that out and we can kind of just look at the difference that the color correction has made. So yeah, what I really like about this is that since I want all of the sunlight to be coming through the windows, this looks a little bit more realistic to me, where up in the corner of the shelving, you're really not getting anything, but you still can kind of see the pictures. They're not completely overpowering the shadows. And when we add in some of our other effects, this won't be as dark, but I'm really happy with how the lighting is looking here. You can also actually see the candle that I put in there too. So yeah, it's coming together already. I really like how the lighting is hitting the vases there. All right, so the next one that I want to talk about is Hyperlight. Hyperlight is sort of similar to ambient occlusion in some way, which is just kind of how I guess like the shadows are. What you're going to notice the most with Hyperlight is that when it's at 100%, it's really filling the scene. I probably wouldn't, you might not even really need to change this. I can go and pull that up now just so that we can sort of take a look at it. But so this is, just needs sometimes takes a second to load here. But with the realistic Hyperlight, what I find the biggest difference is the shadows in the corners. So these kind of corners is very, I guess, like very common in Lumion. Whatever ways kind of the light interacts with it, you typically get the corners being very dark, but Omnishadow can help control that. It'll also help control the shadows up in the shelving. So this is 0. So you could probably just remove, like if you remove the Hyperlight completely, that's what you're going to get. But this is the default one that comes with the realistic effect stack. So you can see right there that it's mostly affecting the shadows, really. Like if you look at the floor where the sun's coming in, it's not affecting it at all. It's really only the shadows that kind of get that, because the Hyperlight, to me, it almost works the same as light balances in things like Blender, where it just kind of helps spread some of the light to the rest of the room. And as you can see, as I go up, you can just sort of see the shadows disappearing. And what I think is a good place to look here are these shadows up in the corner. So now we have a very faint black line at 100. But if I go down, the shadow is much thicker here. So if you're having a problem where you just can't get the corners correct in your scene, Hyperlight is probably a pretty good place to start, but then also the shadow effect, which is coming up here, and we will talk about it. So for this one, I'll probably just leave it at 25. It is a good effect to have. Skylight, though. Now, this one, I don't recommend you be using for videos, even though this is, in my opinion, the most powerful lighting stack, because it just fills the rest of the scene. It makes it look realistic. But the way that Lumion does that is, I believe they move the sun slightly and then take 5 samples. So it can almost quadruple your render times if you turn everything up. So I typically turn these 2 on, and I think I'm going to turn the brightness up. But let's just look at some of the ones that I rendered out so that we can get a better idea of how it works. So this is this is just the default realistic stack as usual. So right off the bat, when I'm going to when I flip through here, all I'm doing is setting it to ultra and hitting these 2, and then we get this effect. So here's the first one, here's the second one. So the area that is best to look at here are the shadows on the floors, and then also the shadow on the chair. So in this scene, we're kind of getting the light hit the chair, but the cushion of the chair almost looks too dark. It doesn't make any sense, but with this one, you're getting much more natural light hitting that. It kind of looks like the chair is getting, the light's hitting it, and then it just looks like it would kind of in an afternoon scene. And so flipping back and forth, you can see that especially too on the, on the shelves, on the pillows. It's just kind of lighting everything up more, and it's also making the shadows not as harsh on the floor, because in real life there's so many light rays bouncing off of things. There's multiple light sources, so you're not going to get these really harsh shadows, but that looks much more realistic. I think that it's the most important thing that you can use. It's just that Skylight is so hard on your computer, so if you are trying to do a video, I would probably say that you kind of have to cut it unless you have a really good computer and you're working on a very large time frame. You could basically render the video 4 times in the time it's going to take you to have this. But there's a couple more effects I want to look at with this. So turning up the brightness and the saturation also has an effect on it. So with this one, we have the full brightness. So this is just the default. This is the first one I showed you, but then that's with the brightness up. So as you can see, we're still getting the same effect. Mostly the shadows on the floor. Along the wall here, we've almost completely blended out that shadow that's coming in from the window, and I really like that. So for this one, I'm going to be putting brightness up all the way, but I've also included saturation on these ones just so you can see. So this is this is just the saturation effect on, and what it just kind of gives it is like this blue feel to it, which again, it depends on kind of what you need for your scene. I would recommend just putting on brightness, the planar reflections, and the projected reflections, and then hit ultra. It just makes it so the whole scene really comes alive. It's the most important one in my opinion. I can't emphasize that enough. So I'm going to turn the brightness all the way up for that, and then let's render out another one just so we can see where we're at. And I do like this. If I come back at the end, and you can just see how much longer this takes. So if I come back at the end, I might actually turn the exposure up a little bit more. But I am really happy with how the light is coming in the window now. Like, I think that you're getting this much more full effect. And if you look at all of the silver and gray decorations on the shelf, you can really see that coming out now. And yeah, so Hyperlight's good. Now, shadow. Shadow is one that you'd think is not actually used for lighting, but it too is one of the most important ones. The sun shadow range I don't really use. The coloring just kind of changes like the temperature of it. This is, again, it doesn't really make a big difference. I probably wouldn't even bother using it. It's just that, if you maybe things are looking a little too cool or hot, you can change that, but for the most part, I wouldn't even bother with that. We have already talked about the Hyperlight, and Omnishadow and Hyperlight, as I was talking about, kind of give you this, like, they kind of help fill in the corners. So I might have even used them interchangeably, but they do give you very similar effects. If you, as I said, if you're having trouble getting the shadows out of the corner the corners of your scene, then Hyperlight and Omnishadow are what you want to use. So let me just go in here and I will just show you some of that. So this is with Omnishadow on 0. So this means that there's going to be basically no shadows in the corners. We don't want that. It just, in this picture, you can see how just unlifelike the shelf is. Like, you might be able to get away with the table. It doesn't look the worst, but the shelf just doesn't make any sense. It looks like there's no shadows in it at all. So just by putting it up to 1, which I think that might be the default. Yeah. Just by putting it up to 1, then you can already see the difference that makes. Like, it's a huge difference. If you go from 1 to 2, there's not as much difference. And then 2 to 3, there's no difference. So I think it just depends on how your scene is kind of composed. But I would definitely always have Omnishadow at least at like 1 or something like that. You don't want it at 0 because then you get no natural lighting. Especially down, if we look down in these corners here along the stairs, as we turn up to 1, you're just getting this much more realistic effect, because when it's like this, it's looking like there's light going behind the couch, which that wouldn't be happening. So that one's good. And as far as brightness goes, this one's another one that kind of, it's just to play around with and to get it right. So the default for this one's set to 0, and I would probably leave that for the most part too, because I find that when you start messing with the brightness of the shadows, it's harder to kind of balance your other effects. It's one of those ones that I think it's important that you know what it does, but I try to go through things like even the other brightness to get that effect. So even just, putting up to 0.3, you can already see that it's completely removed all the shadows. It's just but how bright the shadows are, and they're just completely blended in here. But then you also still get this weird effect when you increase that. You can still see the shadows up here, but the whole scene's light, which just to the eyes it doesn't look right. Like, you see, it almost looks like this like moldy wood, because you're just getting these like small shadows in there. And so yeah, this I would just keep this at 0 for now. But yeah, with shadow, there's not too much to change. I'd probably actually just put this up at like 0.8 for the Omnishadow. I don't know, we'll make that 1 because that's what I liked before. So yeah, with sharp shadows, I don't use those at all either, because in real life you typically don't have sharp shadows unless you're doing some studio lighting and you really want the maybe like a couch or whatever model you're showing off to have these really strong shadows coming down. I wouldn't even bother changing it. Just leave it on normal and make sure that soft shadows and fine detail shadows are on. They really do add a lot to your scene. So the next one that I want to talk about is global illumination. Now, I figured that I should include this in the tutorial, but I do not use this at all. I don't totally understand how the effects work, and I just think that it makes things more complicated than it really has to be. So if I put the sun effect at like 0.4 and then the fall off speed, it like to 0, you can select the pot lights and stuff with that, which I don't totally understand, but you can kind of see how it lights up your scene here. And that's the normal one. And then if I put the sun on 0.4 and the fall off of 0.4, this happens. But it's another one of those ones that like other effects can do what it does. And since I don't totally understand how this works, but it's so easy to just completely blow your scene out with it, I just don't think it's worth using. I have played around with using it strictly with no lights, 2 like spotlights, and to make a realistic lamp. Maybe I'll talk about that in a different video, because I did have some results with it that I liked, but ultimately just don't even worry about this. I think a lot of people want to use it right off the bat because you're like, oh, I need to illuminate my scene, global illumination. You don't need it for lighting your scene. So the next one we're going to look at is just the real skies. I think that's kind of an interesting one. So setting, it is kind of weird because the way that the afternoon and the cloudy and stuff work, you should be like, oh, it's an afternoon scene, I'll use that. But I don't totally think you should think about it like that. You just have to use the lighting that works the best. And keep in mind that so right now this model is right on the ground. So even though it's clearly an afternoon scene, in this example, the light is coming through the windows and we're not getting any kind of action where we want it to, because it's just too high up. But if we were actually on like the 30th floor like this apartment looks like, you'd have light streaming through the windows. So I'm not going to use this one, but with the real skies, just use the one that you think works the best. Most of the time when I'm using Lumion, I'm going to put a background photo in, and I'm going to let that kind of be the way that my lighting gets into the scene. Even if it's right on the ground, I'm going to have this, you know, if this is an example here, I'm going to have, you know, all the clouds most of the time, because then there's no weird line where the buildings get cut off if you do it in Photoshop. That's another tutorial that I'll get into. But for now, just kind of I'm just kind of flipping through this. This one's kind of interesting because this is the nighttime scene, but I have all these other effects going on. So even though I chose a night HDRI, it's completely bright outside, but you also get to kind of see how strong the spotlights are. So even at 1, this is 1 out of the default 300, and that's how strong the lights still are. Mind you, I did use the floodlight, but that's why I'm saying that the lighting doesn't look too bad here on the shelves, but you just have to use it so sparingly. Like, unless it's an absolute last resort, I don't use the spotlights at all. I also just turned these emissive just to make the ceiling look a little more realistic, but you don't really need that. And then, yeah, so overcast, again, just kind of blah. Doesn't really do anything for this scene. And then the sunset, which doesn't really make any sense here because, again, you have this overcast, cool light coming through, but then it's this extremely warm sunset inside. So you don't ever want to do something like this either, because it just, right off the bat, someone would go, that's a render. It doesn't make any sense. Like that would never, you couldn't make this lighting happen in real life. And so, yeah, this is just another sunset. But you get the point with real skies. You just kind of have to do what works. Don't ever limit yourself to being like, oh, it's an afternoon scene, I have to use this one. Or like, oh, it's not cloudy out, I'm not going to use the cloudy one. Just do the one that has the best sun position. Speaking of which, I also want to show you that you can use the sun and real skies within the same scene. While it's kind of rare, like I can normally get the lighting that I want, it is possible. So an example here is this now. Oh, I think I have to go back to what oh no, so that is the right one. But just the sun height, where that is. So this, need to find where this is going. So I think if I move this down, yeah, then you can kind of control the sun. And that's what's kind of weird about this, is that the sun, you can move the sun around and you get these different effects, but you still have your real skies in there. So most of the time, just use real skies. But if you have a scene where it just will not work, you can kind of match the sun lighting to do what you want, because it typically has more controls, but then you'll still have the real skies in the background. So that's just another one of those things that, like, it's good to know, but you shouldn't have to worry too much about that. I've probably used it like once in our renders. And typically, like, if I have to use the sun, I'll just completely remove real skies as it is and then put in a background shot. But, you know, since we're kind of going and having a pretty thorough tutorial, I figured I should show you that. Typically, I just want to mention this too. This is not a lighting effect, but I just like to turn the sharpness or sharpen up to like 0.2 just to get a little bit more effect in there. And the other thing I want to kind of mention is just put reflection planes on stuff. These really slow down the models, but I just think that they're too important. Like, they give you very realistic effects. And while we're talking about reflection, I'm actually going to come in here and drop a reflection cube or a reflection control, and that's just going to make all the other, I guess I already have one in there. But what this is going to do is this just makes it so that all of, like, the little, like, the orbs and that kind of stuff will have some reflections in them. We can talk about this another time, but typically, if you're going to render like an animation and you don't have one of these in, you're going to get all these really, like, almost like pixelated shadows, and it's really easy to tell when someone doesn't use one of these cubes. It's easy to just drop them in, and that's all you have to do for that one. But we'll finish up the lighting. I think that's most of the effects. We did color correction, exposure, hyperlight, real skies, shadows. Yeah, so the last one I really want to talk about is volumetric sunlight. So a lot of people might know this, but volumetric sunlight is almost like this almost like a spotlight effect, like this thick light that goes through the air. Whenever I see it, what I kind of think of is almost like this, like almost like a dusty effect. If you have like a strong spotlight and then you throw almost like powder or dust up in the air, you can actually see where that beam of light goes through, and sort of the effect of when it goes through water as well. So it can be a very strong effect, and I feel like most people, when they turn it on, they see it and they're like, oh, whoa, that's not what I want. So yeah, because this is, this is crazy. Like, what does this do? But if you turn the brightness all the way down to like almost like 0, and then I turn the range up a little bit, as you can see, as you turn the range up, it kind of gets further away, and we just want a little tiny bit coming through the windows. So I think that that's actually going to be good, and I'll render this one out now. And I think that this is almost our final working one. And I'm kind of looking at this to myself, and I'm saying, I think the exposure to the brightness has to come up a little bit more. I do really like the contrast of the scene, but I do want the shelf and the pots to show off a little bit more, and I don't really like how, I guess, colorful that is, considering that it's in the dark. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to exposure. I'm just going to turn that back up. Actually, I'm going to reset that. So now it's back to 0.5. All you have to do is go in, click this, and it goes back to what the effect stack has at the beginning. Now, for most of the effects, it doesn't matter what order they're in. The only one that I've found actually matters enough that it messed up my scene is the sun and the real skies. Unless you absolutely know what you want to do with it, don't have both of them up, because it can just cause a lot of problems that you don't want. And then I'm actually going to turn this back up to 0.7. Let's render this out, and we're going to see if that kind of gives us the effect that we want. Yeah, so right there, now I can see what I wanted, because I didn't want the shelf in the back to be completely gone, but I also don't want it to have that much lighting on it, because it's this, this afternoon scene. I want the majority of the light to really be emphasized on the exterior in this area. I want to have some interesting light coming in here from the spotlight, the skylight, right on the chair, on the pillows. And then the volumetric light, I probably should just show you this, actually. So the volumetric light, it almost gives it this, like, as I said, like this dusty, this lived-in effect. You just have to use it very sparingly, because it will just overpower everything. Even in this one, this example I have, I would even kind of consider maybe not going that high, because, we have some greens down here in the background, and they're just getting completely powered out. The red from this spire here too. So it's this is just what you think looks best. There's no right or wrong with it. As long as it's not completely eating your scene, then it shouldn't be a problem. Yeah, so this is the final render, I guess, and I'm pretty happy with that. I think the shadows aren't too strong. We have the skylight kind of giving some more definition to our chair, our couch, the shelving. I also put a realistic or a fine nature plant in there because of the subdivision surface. That's just the effect that when light goes through a leaf or even snow, that you have some light getting through. It almost has a glow to it, but it's mostly opaque. It's like translucent, but not super translucent. So I think that this turned out pretty well. And I did this basically without spotlights. As I touched on in the very beginning, I think that the most important thing for people to keep in mind is that those spotlights can really, really eat your scene up. It will take away all the shadows. It just won't look realistic. Like sometimes the spotlights are more overpowering than the actual sun, and you just don't want that. I think using Lumion, you almost always want to have the real skies coming in through the windows, or as I said, just knock a wall out and have that natural light coming in, and then play around with like exposure, that kind of stuff if you need shadows. The more that you can do in the effect stacks, I think the better, because it just looks more realistic that way. And most people kind of starting off, they wouldn't really think that. Like when I first started, I almost... I didn't totally understand the rendering portion of Lumion. I was like, I'm just going to make this look as best as I can in the scene. I want the shadows to show up. I wanted to do this stuff. But if you only look at the viewport and you don't actually render the previews out, you will not get the effect that you want. It's something that you have to just keep working on. Like for this tutorial, I think I did have to print out some of the pictures just to show you guys, but you know, I think I did like 80 plus photos. And even after I knew what my effect stack was going to be, I still printed 6 or 7 out just so that you can kind of go back, and if there's a particular time that you can see that you like that. Let me pull up the lighting renders here. So this was kind of this is just the default, and as you can see, I'm adding more and more to it. Oh, I kind of messed up the camera angle, but you get the point anyways. It's that last one is, so this one I was like, this is the second last one. It's the final, basically effects. I said, you know what? I like this, but we're just going to bring the brightness up a bit. And then here we are. And then I think that that's a pretty good kind of afternoon shot. The feeling that I get from this kind of looking at it is that like, you know, obviously someone's living here. It's just that it's not that warm of a scene, and it looks like almost like this. It's like this boring, the person's going to be coming home soon, but there's no one there at the time. If it was warmer, it almost feel like the person is in the other room. So yeah, it's just, again, there's no really wrong answer with lighting. It all depends on what you want to convey in your picture. You know, whether that's the temperature, even just the climate, that kind of stuff. Like a good example of this is actually in Breaking Bad. Whenever they show the Mexican cartel, in Mexico, they always use this really warm filter because they want, the makers of the show wanted you to know immediately that in these scenes, you're in Mexico. So even though nothing's really changing, they just make everything this really like reddish, warm look to know that, you know, you've kind of moved the scene. And to some degree, you can kind of replicate that in your animations as long as you have an idea going in to making the scene that what you want to convey to the person. I think that is all the effects that I wanted to show. You can also use the color lab, but the analog color lab, but there's so much to kind of unpack with that one, and there's so many different uses for it that I just said, you know what, I'm gonna do that. I'll talk about it in another video. If you are gonna use it, just turn it up a little bit. It's, unless you're going for a really stylized look, you don't really need it. The effects that I showed you are all you really should need to light your scene up. And yeah, so hopefully that tutorial really helped you guys out. I know that there was a lot to go kind of unpack here, so I'm going to be breaking this down into different time slots so that, you know, you don't have, like, if you want to find just like what the bloom does, you just click that, and you can always come back to this video. You can watch it all the way through if you want, or if you just want to, you know, mess around with color correction, I'll have it set up so you can click directly to that, and this can just be a reference that you can keep going back to. So yeah, thanks a lot, guys. I will see you in the next video, and thanks a lot for checking out the channel.